Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, South African health authorities are ordered to pay $15 million in compensation to the families of mental health patients who died of negligence after having been sent to what judges have branded death traps. And in Burundi, a presidential decree sets the date for the controversial referendum on a possible change to the constitution. If President Nkurunziza wins, he'll be able to stand for 2 more 7-year mandates after 2020. And Cape Town's cup is far from running over. The 3-year-long drought in Western Cape's not just hit families, but businesses too, including the region's world-renowned wine industry. We take a closer look. We turn first to South Africa, where the government of Gauteng province has been ordered to pay $15 million in damages to the families of at least 144 psychiatric patients who died of negligence. Some of the deaths were due to pneumonia, dehydration and diarrhea, preventable conditions that came about after patients were moved to accommodation that were labelled as being death traps in court on Monday. In 2016, as part of a cost-cutting measure, about 1,300 patients were shifted from the unit of the Life Healthcare Group care centres to other charities in the province, in a policy that judges ruled violated the constitutional rights of patients. Well, for a closer look at Monday's judgment, we hear from Jane Flanagan. She's here to tell us more. Jane, was the outcome on Monday in the courts expected?
Well, I think that the sums of money that were announced by the judge exceeded expectations of the families and their lawyers. But more importantly than that, or just as important perhaps, is the language that the judge used, the hard-hitting language and the frankness he used in his judgment, in which he described the way in which these very vulnerable people had been treated by the authorities with such little disregard, and the fact that he didn't pull any punches and criticised the department and the government and handed down these massive compensation awards, I think really exceeded the expectations of the families and those of us who've been following the case so closely.
And does this case reflect much about the state of mental health care in South Africa?
Well, I think South Africa is often accused of being a place where human life is not worth much. We're used to our daily dose of stories about the way in which women and children are treated, the way in which the poor are regarded. And I think the way in which the mentally ill patients were treated in this case really shows how entirely worthless they were considered by the authorities. We heard weeks of harrowing evidence about the way in which they were treated by the authorities, almost as though the authorities couldn't believe anyone was watching or that anyone would care. We heard about the way in which they were rounded up like cattle. They were tied up, put on the back of buses, trucks, lorries, and shipped out to these facilities which were unlicensed and certainly unable to care for them. We heard evidence from some of the families about how it took them weeks to track down their loved ones. Some of those people who were moved on that day 2 years ago still haven't been traced. The first lady to die was found to have plastic and paper in her stomach. She literally was being starved to death by the facility who was supposed to be looking after her, and she was grabbing at anything she could lay her hands on to feed herself. And in her case, it was her medical records and a plastic bag. It really did remind me quite a bit of the Truth and Reconciliation hearings we heard in the wake of the transfer of power from white minority rule. It really laid bare the way in which people had been degraded, and it was positive to hear that the judge spared no criticism for those in authority who were being paid to look after these people and keep them in care. So a terrible human rights abuse, one of the worst we've seen in modern South African democracy.
Thanks very much. Jane Flanagan there for us in Cape Town. Plans to launch an Africa-wide free trade treaty have taken a blow after Nigeria's president announced on Monday that he would not be attending its launch. It's the continent's top economy. The meeting starts in Rwanda on Wednesday, but on Monday, Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari pulled out reportedly to take time for more domestic consultations on the deal. 54 countries were supposed to endorse the African Continental Free Trade Treaty area in a bid to expand intra-African trade. At least 17 people died in Madagascar after a powerful tropical storm swept through the island over the weekend. More than 6,000 people were displaced when Storm Eliakim hit about 600 kilometers northeast of Antananarivo on Saturday night. The country's been hit by about 40 cyclones and tropical storms over the past decade. Many have been fatal. In Burundi, the presidential decree has set the date for the controversial referendum on a possible change to the constitution. If President Nkurunziza wins, he would be able to stand for 2 more 7-year mandates after 2020. He's already been in power for 13 years. The opposition leaders, most of whom live in exile, say that this referendum is dangerous for ethnic minorities. Nicolas Chemin tells us more.
This referendum, President Nkurunziza could remain in power until 2034. It will take place on the 17th of May. A decree signed Sunday says the reforms will be adopted if the yes wins by more than 50%. But the opposition says this is contrary to the constitution. In theory, any change to the constitution needs a 4/5 majority in parliament and 2/3 in the Senate. But Nkurunziza's allies welcomed the decree.
This referendum had been planned. We're preparing it, and this presidential decree is legal and normal.
The campaign can only start in early May, but the opposition claims the ruling party has been campaigning for months, while those who are against a change of the constitution have been arrested. The opposition believes the referendum is a threat to the Arusha peace agreement that ended years of ethnic conflict.
This will mean power will be concentrated in the hands of one person or one political party. This will lead to the exclusion of political and ethnic minorities, and the consequence is that they will be in physical danger.
If the yes vote wins, Nkurunziza could run for 2 7-year mandates after 2020 and stay in power until 2034. He is following in the footsteps of his regional rival Paul Kagame of Rwanda. Kagame organised a referendum that means he could remain president until 2035.
On Monday, the UN warned that almost 6 billion people risk running out of drinking water by 2050 globally. It's a grim prospect raised at the 8th World Water Forum that's currently being held in Brasilia. Now, this year, the focus was on the collapse of water supplies in major urban centres, an issue that's been highlighted by the drought in Cape Town in South Africa that is throwing lives and livelihoods into jeopardy.
A 3-year-long drought in the Western Cape has caused the region's dams to reach critically low water levels. Water restrictions have not just hit families, but businesses too, including the region's world-renowned wine industry.
Well, the berries are smaller to start with because they contain less water, and it really actually improves the quality to a certain extent, but it's not very sustainable to farm like that because the smaller your berry, the less is your yield. So you have a smaller harvest, and obviously when you have a smaller harvest, you have less wine to sell at the end of the day. So it's a financial impact.
Wine production has slumped by about 20% over the last 12 months, forcing winemakers like Marlies to consider vines that require less water.
Obviously, we're looking into getting grape cultivars that can sustain the heat and the drought. Spanish cultivars are very popular, as well as Italian cultivars. That doesn't need as much water. So I think there will be a general shift, but it's very difficult because the market doesn't really know or recognize those wines.
Fruit growers are also feeling the brunt, with industry bodies warning that thousands of jobs are on the line.
In a situation like this, there's a very big focus on cutting costs as well, because you don't know what next year will hold for you. So there will be a negative impact on labour usage.
It seems the efforts have paid off, with the estimate for the so-called Day Zero, when taps run dry, pushed back from next month to 2019. In the meantime, South Africa's wine industry can only hope for a little rain to make up the shortfall.
Well, staying in South Africa, the 15th edition of the Cape Epic cycling race started in Cape Town over the weekend. Hundreds of riders are traversing 658 kilometres across the mountains before they reach the finish line next Sunday. Manuel Fumic of Germany and Brazil's Henrique Avancini won stage 1 of the race on Monday in Robertson, South Africa. After finishing second on Sunday's prologue, their stage put them in the lead, about 40 seconds ahead of second-placed riders. In the women's event, multiple world champion Annika Langvad of Denmark and Cape Epic rookie Kate Courtney of the US dominated the stage from start to finish to claim victory. Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks very much for joining us. Do so again if you can. Take care.
We are journalists, and normally you have to listen to us, but you have things to tell us too. Maybe you've experienced a dramatic event, or you've got something important to say. You want to make a difference. That is why we created The Observers. Now, the first step is very easy. You get in touch with our team. Send us your images, tell us what you've seen. And then it's our job to get your voice out there, on our site, on social networks, on your mobiles and tablets, and on TV, of course. You can appear in our weekly show via webcam. Or perhaps we'll come see you in person, where you live, in your country, your town, and we'll work together on a report for our investigative show, The Observers Direct. So you get the idea. This show is your show, your way to get your voice out to the world.